The idea of medicine and science go hand in hand today, but the foundation of American wellness was built from strict religious doctrine, anti-black pseudoscience, and the control of women's bodies. That may sound like history, but it's a history that still shapes the choices, policies, and even headlines we see today. This year, many people across the country were shocked when the Trump administration appointed Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to lead our national health agencies. Kennedy is long known for promoting vaccine conspiracies, has spent years undermining the very idea of public health and evidence-based medicine, and to most, his appointment felt like a betrayal of progress. But in truth, this country has a long precedent for elevating moral ideology above sound scientific integrity in medicine. From the earliest days of the American medical system, health has been shaped not only by research, but by religion, by powerful men who used the language of purity to decide who was worthy of care and who was not. One of the most influential of those men came right here from the Midwest, Dr. John Harvey Kellogg. A physician, preacher, and businessman from Michigan, Kellogg believed that the body was a vessel for moral order, and that discipline of appetite, thought, and desire was a path to salvation. And he formed the cereal company. At his Battle Creek Sanitarium, health was a ritual. Guests, many of whom were wealthy and well-connected, followed a strict routine of baths, grains, silence, and surveillance. The smell of boiled cereal and disinfectant filled the halls. Every bell, every schedule, every meal was designed to purify the body. And in his view, the soul. To his followers, Kellogg represented progress, the promise of modern medicine. But beneath that promise lay a theology of control, a belief that sickness was sin, that purity was a sign of worth, and that women, and black people in particular, were in constant need of correction. His empire could only have risen in a place like the Midwest, a region built on the marriage of faith, reform, and industry, a place where order was considered divine. The Midwest that raised John Harvey Kellogg was already a landscape of conquest. By early 1800s, the U.S. government had seized millions of acres of indigenous land and opened it to white settlement in the name of manifest destiny. The people who arrived were not rugged pioneers. They were the sons of merchants, ministers, and land speculators from the East. They came with capital, religion, and a conviction that God had chosen them to build a moral frontier. Churches and schools rose before roads. The Second Great Awakening swept through the region, fusing salvation with productivity and temperance with success. Men were told to govern their impulses while women were told to embody purity, and those sermons echoed in classrooms and eventually in medicine lecture halls. The result was a new kind of hierarchy, one that linked cleanliness to whiteness, faith to discipline, and health to moral superiority. This was the soil that nurtured John Harvey Kellogg, a boy raised in a devout Seventh-day Adventist family that viewed diet, abstinence, and self-control as sacred. By the time he entered medicine as a young man, the profession itself was still forming. Doctors were just as likely to preach as they were to diagnose, and for Kellogg, medicine was not about discovery. It was about devotion to his faith, and that devotion required control. Kellogg became a superintendent of Battle Creek Sanitarium in his 20s and built what was in many ways a temple to purification. Part hospital, part spa, and part factory, it drew in thousands of wealthy clientele each year. From industrialists and preachers to socialites, they all came seeking cures and redemption. They found a gospel in self-denial. No meat, no alcohol, and no sex. Diets of grains and vegetables with electric baths, enemas, fasting, and constant moral instruction. Kellogg warned that pleasure itself was dangerous, that indulgence weakened the body and the race. He saw black folks, immigrants, and the poor as biologically inferior and a threat to national vitality. His Race Betterment Foundation, founded in 1911, became one of the earliest eugenics organizations in the country. At his conferences, he and other speakers would promote race hygiene, calling for segregation, sterilization, and restrictions on marriage, all in the name of public health. Between 1907 and 1940, More than 60,000 people were forcibly sterilized under laws that were inspired by this thinking. Most were women who were poor and black women or other racial others and people of color. These acts were celebrated as reform, progressive measures as good for society. Kellogg's power came not just from medicine, but from marketing. He took the moral strictures of church and turned them into rituals of everyday life. Breakfast, bathing, and exercise became acts of virtue under his purview, and a bowl of cereal became a symbol of purity. Clean, simple, white. His influence outlived him and helped cement the idea that health was not a matter of care, but of character. As a medicine professionalized, Kellogg's belief didn't fade away, they evolved. He wrote that self-control is the law of human life, and to him, indulgence was the root of every disease. Pleasure, in his mind, was a pathology. His approach gave rise to a culture where morality masqueraded as science, and for women, this meant that their bodies were subject to endless correction. Doctors labeled female sexuality as hysteria. Kellogg even endorsed surgical procedures, cauterization, and clitoridectomy as cures for women deemed overly sexual and unruly. For Black Americans, this pseudoscience took another form. Medical journalists published claims of racial inferiority and biological defect, theories used to justify segregation and neglect. Eugenicists argued that the civilization depended on protecting white bloodlines, and that language of purity became policy. At fairs and universities, better baby and fitter family contests scored children on symmetry and posture. Health, beauty, and race were folded into one measurement of worthiness that still shines through in different types of pageantry we see today. By the 1910s, the same obsession with purity had merged with industrial efficiency. Bodies, like machines, were to be trimmed, measured, and managed. Calories and waistlines became the new moral currency. Home economics courses taught women that a clean kitchen and a slim body were signs of good citizenship. The first modern diet manuals declared that the enemy is fat, read as black folks and other racial people. Moderation was morality, thinness was proof of self-control, and doctors handed authority over normal body weight and image to fashion leaders decades after dispute about whether the ideal woman should be waifish or more robust and better for bearing children. Actuarial tables and bad data had muddied the meaning of health, and instead of challenging bias in medicine, they deferred to these designers and beauty editors that pushed a smaller, thinner body. As historian Sabrina Strings writes in Fearing the Black Body, this was a turning point. By giving cultural authority to fashion, medicine allowed racial and moral hierarchies to shape public health. Thinness became proof of discipline and whiteness, while fuller figures, especially those linked to blackness or labor, were cast as weakness or moral failure. Magazines and department stores amplified this message. Slenderness became both beauty and citizenship, the mark of a woman who was modern and morally sound. Across the Midwest, factories produced soaps, cereals, and corsets, all under the same philosophy: purification. Cleanliness wasn't next to godliness, it was godliness, bottled and sold. By the 1930s, the wellness was an industry. Cereal promised clean living made easy, and advertisements warned that odor, weight, or blemishes could ruin one's reputation. Health was no longer a right, it was a responsibility. Over a century later, and we still moralize hunger and disguise shame as self-care. Even our health policies echo his creed. We talk about personal responsibility for health outcomes while ignoring the conditions that shape them: housing, air, wages, and access to care. This is the inheritance of worshiping weight, a culture that confuses obedience with health and control with care. But this history offers us a perspective and a choice: to move from measuring virtue with pounds and purity and color to measuring well-being and dignity, access, and collective care.